Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
House Republicans finally worked out the math to pass President Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill. After hours of meetings and pressure from the president, the 215 to 214 House vote marked a major win for House Speaker Mike Johnson. But as the bill heads to the Senate, it's expected to hit some serious roadblocks. Republican Senator Rand Paul voiced his concerns on Fox News Sunday.
Somebody has to stand up and yell, "The emperor has no clothes," and everybody's falling in lockstep on this. Pass the big, beautiful bill. Don't question anything. Well, conservatives do need to stand up and have their voice heard. This is a problem we've been facing for decades now, and if we don't stand up on it, I really fear the direction the country is going.
Meanwhile, despite what was called a productive phone call between President Trump and President Putin last week, Russia spent the weekend wreaking havoc in Ukraine, launching a record 355 drones in a single overnight assault. The unprovoked escalation left President Trump stunned. He took to Truth Social, writing that Putin had, quote, gone absolutely crazy. And here at home, conversation continues about what President Biden's inner circle allegedly knew and concealed about his mental decline. To discuss this and more, we bring in our panel, Washington correspondent and political reporter for Fox News Radio, Jared Halpern, Republican strategist Colin Reed, and former State Department spokeswoman, Fox News contributor Marie Harf. All right, Jared, first of all, the Putin back and forth and what the president is saying about Putin seems to be a dramatic shift in the way he's talking about this. And the question is whether it changes what exactly is being done.
I think the question now becomes, are sanctions a real possibility? President Trump has, for a few weeks now, hinted at ratcheting up sanctions, imposing new sanctions on Russia if he felt that they were not making a good faith effort in these ceasefire talks. Over the weekend, President Trump certainly expressed his frustration in a way that we have not heard from him in a long time, and it is bringing him more in line with an awful lot of lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats alike, who have long supported ratcheting up this type of pressure and sanctions on Vladimir Putin. And so now we wait and see, are there new sanctions? What do those look like? And what does it mean for the shuttle diplomacy that the president has sort of been ordering his diplomats to do? As they talk with Ukraine, talk with Russia. You've had the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, agree to 30-day ceasefires. You have not seen that on the part of the Russians. There has been reporting, and President Trump has said himself that the U.S. could walk away from that process, and questions are raised about what does that look like? Does that mean walking away from the situation writ large, not continuing the type of assistance that the U.S. is providing Ukraine, or is it simply walking away from trying to host and negotiate these talks? But certainly, I think the question on a lot of lawmakers' minds now is whether or not the president is going to pull the trigger on sanctions against Russia.
And Marie, you know, there's some foreign policy experts who are saying, we told you so. I mean, Putin was never a guy that you could look at and say he's going to do what he says he's going to do at the beginning.
I mean, this is certainly not a surprise to most experts of both political parties watching this situation, or of course to the Ukrainians who've been getting hammered every day by Vladimir Putin for years. So it's interesting that President Trump finally woke up and is seeing Putin for what he is. It's also interesting now that Russian propaganda outlets and Russian state media are making fun of President Trump, basically saying, oh, you're going to get really tough until you change your mind and tweet something different. So, you know, this idea that he changes his mind a lot, that he will often flip-flop on issues, that has consequences. I think Jared's absolutely right. Congress wants more sanctions, but sanctions don't end wars. And so the question is whether the Trump administration will actually support Ukraine. And just remember, it was only a few months ago that epic blow up in the Oval Office between Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Trump administration. Since then, Zelensky has offered ceasefires. He has come to the table. He has demonstrated that he is acting in good faith, while Putin obviously is doing the opposite. So I think there are a lot of questions here, but the real one for me is whether they actually support Ukraine, not just sanction Russia, but support Ukraine in this fight. Or if, Trump just looks at the situation and says, Putin's crazy, I don't like Zelensky, I'm walking away from it. I think that could have really serious consequences for Europe. Europeans are already looking to step up, allowing Ukrainians to use weapons without range restrictions, for example. So Europe really at a crossroads too. In this moment, Trump will be meeting with European leaders at a NATO summit coming up in the not too distant future. It will be very interesting to see how he goes into that meeting.
Yeah, a couple things. One is I've been told that the weapons have not stopped, even though there's been concern, and the president's been very public about his concern about how the spending's gone. The flow of weapons to Ukraine has not stopped. And the ability to use long-form weapons, in other words, long range, actually increased in the Trump administration, and it took a long time for the Biden administration to get there. Secondly, Colin, this has been multi-administrations. 2014 when Putin wants Crimea and there's a whole back and forth and President Obama says this cannot stand. And then, by the next weekend, they had new passports and a new time zone in Crimea. So we've had this back and forth with Putin before. The question is, what's going to change?
And don't forget, you can go back 5 years earlier from that, Bret, to 2009 and the famous Russian reset the Obama administration oversaw and took credit for before he marched into Ukraine and seized Crimea. I mean, look, for all the President Trump prides himself on his unpredictability, especially when it comes to foreign policy, but for all of the different iterations of this debate and this negotiation, there's been two clear principles President Trump has had going back to the campaign trail and for his first few months as president. And one is he wants to end this war. And two, he views peace as something that can be achieved through commerce and the ability to do business with one another. And we saw that, of course, during his most recent Middle East trip, Bret, and topics that you talked about with him in that interview over there. And it's something that I think can kind of be applied to this situation. And if you look at these current Russian sanctions, the potential talk for sanctions, which all of a sudden took on new heightened importance after the weekend's events, I mean, Senator Lindsey Graham has 82 co-sponsors on a bill that would hit countries that buy Russian oil and gas. That's 82 co-sponsors. It's really hard to find 82 senators that agree on much of anything these days. And this is not something that should be taken lightly because energy sales are Putin's lifeline. 63% of all Russian exports are energy related. So you start really hitting him with these energy sanctions, as President Biden was reluctant to do, probably because he was at the same time shutting down all of domestic oil and gas here at home. That's the one thing that can really hit Putin where it hurts. And don't forget, they've lost 1 million lives, Bret. 1 million Russian soldiers have been lost in this war to date. That's twice what America lost over the course of World War II. It's a huge human consequence. So you really put your foot down on some of those energy sanctions, you can really start putting Putin in a spot where he doesn't have the cards and where he's forced to come back to the negotiating table and wind this thing down in a way that allows him to save face.
But, Jared, why isn't that bill moving forward, the 82 sponsors on the Russian oil?
Well, I think there's been a willingness to see what President Trump wants to do here. The president has made clear that he wants to negotiate this. It is unusual to see Republicans kind of publicly break from President Trump. That being said, over the weekend, you did see senators like Chuck Grassley and others say, now's the time to issue these sanctions. So I think the reason you haven't seen that move forward in the way that we may see it move forward now in the days and weeks ahead is simply out of deference to President Trump and his ability perhaps to see if he can negotiate a ceasefire. Clearly, those ceasefire negotiations are not going as planned for President Trump, as we saw over the weekend, him saying that President Putin is crazy following one of the most aggressive airstrike campaigns we've seen since the war began.
Panel, we'll hold it right there. And Marie, the big beautiful bill moves on, but the Senate, it may not be so beautiful to some Republicans even.
That's right. I think there are a couple of problems here for Senate Republicans. Number one, this would be the largest cut to Medicaid and food assistance in American history. And I think there are a lot of Republican senators who are uncomfortable with this. If you talk about people like Josh Hawley from Missouri and others, I think cutting some of those programs, look, the biggest loser coming out of the House are these moderate swing state Republicans who had to vote for this bill, who ended up voting for it, and who have to wear Medicaid cuts around them heading into the midterms. But there are other problems. There are Republicans who want deeper cuts in terms of not raising the debt as much, not raising the deficit as much. They want more spending cuts. It is really hard to cut more on spending if you're increasing defense spending by so much. You are going to start touching programs that touch everyday Americans, people who voted for Republicans, people who love Donald Trump. And I think Senate Republicans are in a real bind here because they want to cut spending, but doing that without really touching defense and actually increasing it by a substantial amount, the math gets really difficult. And those tax cuts, I know everyone gets tax cuts, but Democrats are going to say you're giving a lot of tax cuts to really wealthy people and you're cutting food assistance for poor kids. That's a tough political message. And I think Senate Republicans are going to do something with the bill that changes it. And then the House, which is really the slimmest majority that got this bill passed to begin with, they're going to have to go back to the drawing board. And Mike Johnson, you can hear him when he goes out and gives interviews. He's nervous about having to reopen this bill after the Senate gets its hands on it.
Yeah. You know, as far as Medicaid cuts, that's not how Dr. Oz, Mehmet Oz, talks about it as head of CMS. Colin, it's not how the administration talks about it. It's not how Speaker Johnson talks about it. Talks about cutting the waste, and what they call waste is people who are not supposed to be in the program. And yes, it's significant, but does it affect everybody else? The way HHS, in their interview with me, talked about it was that by what they're doing, they're going to secure the spending for everybody else so that they don't lose their benefits. Different ways of messaging, but they are seeing cuts in the program.
Well, the alternative to doing anything at all is to do nothing, and to do nothing is to let Medicaid eventually become insolvent. So that's a disingenuous argument for anyone who purports to value the long-term stability and viability of Medicaid. But here's the thing that Republicans have. They have two things the Democrats don't. One, they have the math, and two, they have a leader. And what that means is with a 53-47 majority in the Senate, that's a fairly comfortable majority these days as margins go. So that means they can lose a senator or two, whether it's Senator Murkowski or Senator Collins, or on the other side, whether it's Senator Johnson or Senator Paul or Senator Hawley, who have different disagreements for different reasons. And even so, they lose a couple of senators, they still have the ability to have President Trump come in there like he did in the House and just steamroll this thing through. And that's what he can do because the party will by and large fall behind him. But the thing that was interesting over the weekend was President Trump said he was fine with the Senate making changes to this bill. He actually encouraged it, and then he wanted it to go back to the House. And then he can come in at the last minute and push this thing through and wield his influence over the party and get it over the finish line. So he's okay with those changes being made. The Democrats, they don't have to do any of that. They don't have the obligations of governing because they lost the election, because they're in the minority, and so they just get to be against everything. But if we're talking about math, I think it's really important to keep in mind what this big, beautiful bill contains. It contains a lot of things, including those tax cuts that Marie mentioned. A little spoiler alert, Bret, every single Senate Democrat is going to vote against this bill. They will because they have to, because that's the partisan nature we live in right now. And that means they vote to raise taxes on pretty much everyone in the universe, in the American country at least. And that includes a $4 trillion tax hike they're going to own if the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires. That's not a good place to be, but that's where they're going because they can't possibly be for anything that the president and the Republicans are for. So my prediction is this will be messy. There'll be fits and starts, but it'll have a similar process to what the House does. And eventually they'll pull a rabbit out of a hat and get this thing done before all is said and done.
Yeah, Jared, I mean, Speaker Johnson has pulled a lot of legislative rabbits out of the congressional hat, but this one, you know, coming back, if it comes back with significant changes, is a little tougher, especially because conservatives really already ate the bad tasting porridge in that they're not getting the big cuts that they want, and if anything, over 10 years, this increases the debt and deficit.
Yeah, the CBO says it increases the federal deficit nearly $4 trillion over that 10-year period. It would include a $698 billion subsidy change in Medicaid. It would revert more money in state spending for things like SNAP and Medicaid as well, according to the Congressional Budget Office. But more importantly for President Trump, the problems that existed in the House are the same problems that exist in the Senate. And so I think you're right. The question becomes, if there are significant changes that the Senate makes, either making this bill more amenable for conservatives or making it more amenable for moderates, what does that do to the math on the House side? You already have Freedom Caucus folks and others who felt like they gave up a lot with things like the SALT deductions for some of these blue state Democrats. They are still looking for cuts. They are still looking for what their big concession will be. I am told that some of that could be done through executive order that the president takes as it relates to some of that mandatory entitlement spending. But as you know, Bret, that is not the same as a tax law that would be much harder to undo by a new administration.
I get a lot of questions, though, Jared, about why isn't Congress codifying these cuts that DOJ is finding, even though it's not equaling all that they said it was going to equal up till this point. Why aren't they putting it in law?
It's a good question. I think in large part because a lot of lawmakers don't see them as really popular. They are worried about jobs in their districts. They are worried about some of the services and how they will reach constituents. Now, I do think that you look at what the House did, and it does codify some. Now, some they're not allowed to codify through a reconciliation bill, and that's the other challenge for Republicans, right, is there are only so many levers you can kind of pull when you use this reconciliation method, and that does limit the way that you can cut spending. But it's a good question whether or not the Congress will separately take up, for instance, a rescissions package, which is something that President Trump has talked about, right, bringing back some of that spending that had previously been authorized to try and codify some of those DOJ cuts that have been identified by Elon Musk and his team.
And last thing, Marie, I mean, we are now on our second week of this coverage of President Biden and his cognitive ability, and this book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, the fallout from it, now congressional hearings pending on who knew what when, and the, ominous auto pen. How far do you think this goes?
I mean, it's a great question. I read the book, the first 24 hours after it came out, reading about people I had worked with in previous administrations on the Democratic side. And I don't know how far those investigations go. I think what was clear to me in the book is that President Biden was able, albeit in a more limited number of hours in every day, to perform the functions of the presidency. At least according to the book, that's what I took away from it. But as a Democrat, what I am furious about is the people around him, starting with the First Lady and other senior advisors, who never once said, you were a transformational president in one term, you promised to be a bridge to the next generation. The threat of President Trump coming back is too great. There is no universe, just physically, in which you can run again for another 4 years. The fact that they hid that, the physical piece of it, and that they did not insist on an actual process to get him to decide whether or not he could, in fact, run again, which he clearly could not, led to the situation we ended up in, where Kamala Harris had 100 days to run a campaign and President Trump is president again. So I think there are a lot of Democrats looking at what happened thinking, we are sad about how the Biden legacy is ending, and that there are a lot of people we blame right now. And of course, the tragedy with his diagnosis. I mean, it's a tragic story all around, but politically, a lot of angry Democrats reading that book, Bret.
And Colin, Jim Comer oversight says he's going down this road, and there are real legal questions. If you've signed an auto pen for a ton of pardons and commutations, are they legally binding if somebody else was controlling the operation?
I went back and looked today, Bret. President Biden signed 162 executive orders over the course of his 4-year term in office. And I think all of those are going to come under renewed scrutiny because unlike regular order and unlike legislation, which has to go through both chambers of Congress and then get signed by the president. An executive order can just be signed unilaterally, and President Biden isn't the only one who's done it. President Trump did it, President Obama, President Bush, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I think that this will now take on such a renewed, heightened interest is because we have no idea who was doing those, who was authorizing these huge sweeping policies. Many of these executive orders that President Biden signed into law, or whoever in the Biden administration signed into law, they were not small, minor things. Many of the initiatives he took, especially early on, trying to reflexively undo many of the Trump policies, these were big things that the President Trump is now undone with his own pen. And that's the reason why people should, both parties should pass more laws and do it the regular way, because then the laws can't seesaw back and forth in the stroke of a pen. But look, in terms of President Biden and the Democrats, he's never going to be in a ballot again. His family's name's never going to be in a ballot again. But the Democrats who are left holding the bag for this, they're going to have to come up with an answer that is somewhat compelling, because right now they sound like they're HR managers talking about how they're looking forward, not back. That's great, but you have to give someone a little bit more something before they want to look forward. I think the intellectually honest argument a Democrat could say is, we knew Biden was gone. We knew he was incapable of running the country, but in our eyes, he was still better than Trump. And that would at least be an argument that some people could get behind. But right now, they're just stuck in this position where they don't have any really persuasive answers. They're pointing the fingers at each other. This book is now on week 2 or 3 of its just nonstop churn of the news cycle. And you've got guys like Rahm Emanuel out there calling the party toxic, weak, and woke. It's just a never-ending doom spiral. They'll get out of it eventually, but it's been 7 months since the election, and it's an extraordinarily long time for a party to just lie there on the mat, unable to pick up and pick up the pieces.
It's hard to believe, but I think this may be, questions in midterm elections, depending on where that stands at that point. Panel, thanks so much. Now for a bit of history. On May 27, 1930, New York's Chrysler Building is completed, briefly becoming the world's tallest building, designed by William Van Allen. The Chrysler Building stood proudly at 1,046 feet tall, with its secretly assembled 180-foot spire serving as the secret weapon that ensured it was the world's tallest skyscraper. Though this title was taken by the Empire State Building the following year, the Chrysler Building remains one of the most striking features of New York City's skyline. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Jared, Marie, and Colin, I'm Bret Baier. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.